Questions? Comments?
In your opinion, who is maybe doing the best job of telling this complicated story about multi-generational Mexican Americans, as you laid out, how complicated that is? Who maybe is writing about that in a way that's true today, about these complicated layers?
Sure.
My second question is why Latino men do so much fare worse than Latino women in colleges.
Okay. The first one, I don't know of anyone who's doing it well. The civil rights movement created this binary, right? White versus whatever group you want. And the hangover of that era is still with us. And in that regard, if you look carefully, particularly at the Latino literature, most of it is urban-based. Gary Soto and others have talked about the rural areas, but it's around that binary, if you will, and very little permutation, nuance as to the points that I was trying to make. And even more so because the novelists of the 80s and the 90s are depicting overwhelmingly the urban experience of Latinos rather than the rural. And I have struggled mightily, I don't know of too many other historians who have, to bring the story of what is taking place in the Central Valley. If you look at all the major novels recently that deal with questions of race and so on, they're overwhelmingly taking place in cities. And there's a great drama taking place in Chicago, Detroit, and so on, Flint, Michigan, right? Sort of thing. But it leaves out, and one of the slides I didn't show you, was how the Valley is growing faster now than Southern California. And because of that, the challenges in that regard, it's very difficult to capture when you're looking at it from Los Angeles, when you're looking at it from the Bay Area. And right now, I don't know if a working Latino writer, or for that matter, a non-Latino writer, that is capturing that nuance. Yes, there are some who look at it from Asian versus Latino versus African Americans and so on, but even those novels are overwhelmingly urban in character. And I don't want to take time away from any questions for Susan, so I'll stop there. Regarding the question of men, if I had the answer to that, I would be rich, all right? I'd be taking on Donald Trump, but I'm not. It is a growing conundrum that people have shied away from, it seems to me. And I think among the reasons we have shied away from it is the multiplicity of reasons that people have come up with. Everything from financial. Well, the men, they don't want to incur debt. I just read an article last night on the way on the train here about that as a way of trying to explain, well, women don't want college debt either. So why do they do better in terms of graduating from community college, from state universities, from UC, from privates, all the way across, as I said earlier, regardless of race, creed, or color, women are doing better when it comes to academic achievement, including among Asians. So how do we explain that? And I think a lot of it has to do with the male culture, a male culture that still represents masculinity in particular ways. And it is a shift that has taken place almost invisibly, if you will. And it's only because women are catching up with the men for all the wrong reasons, in my opinion. Because when you look at the wage gap between men and women, it's not necessarily about women making big strides in income. It's about men's wages either stagnating or going down. That's what's closing the gap. And there is still a gender gap, but particularly for working class people, working class men, working class women, the wage gap, and you've all seen the figures, productivity is like this, wages have been flat, generally speaking. Robert Reich and everybody and their grandmother at Berkeley is talking about it, but no one is talking about it in a gendered way, much less of what's taking place in places like rural California. So I'll stop there, and maybe Susan has some insight in that respect. I don't know. But since you asked me the question, I've responded. The other question here.
I do have one thing to add to that, only because I think that it's not just true of Latino men, but, men and all, I think generally, certainly when Color Purple came out, it was about, why is this, say bad rap on African American men. But I think that the education system tends to reward the kind of work that little girls and women do, following the rules. It's just, I don't think there's enough for me, and this is also speaking of my own son. I think that we took shop and things working with your hands and that sense of what a lot of boys did to get through school, and that's gone. And I just think it makes it more difficult that we put value on. One of the first things Steinbeck ever wrote was in his high school yearbook about every high school needs shop. And, but I think we do need to have alternatives to thinking that just you should read novels and that's the way through English class and write grammatically and that's the way to succeed. And it doesn't leave enough room for people who don't want to do that. And often, I think at least that's my experience. My son needed photography to get, I have a stepson who needed shop to get through school. Not that, it's just a different kind of way of learning. That sounds really sexist, but I sometimes think we just don't think about different learning styles in gendered ways as we should. So,
the young lady in the back.
Well, I just have to take a little tiny issue, and then I actually do have a question. For one thing, male enrollment hasn't gone down in college. Mm-hmm. Okay, what has gone up is women's enrollment. And I think we need to be careful not to say, more than necessary, a great concern about males in college. We need to, of course, be looking at that, but let us not forget that that gap is growing because there are more women who are enrolling in college. And part of the reason why women are enrolling in college is because they get a better return on their college investment than men do, partly because of, as was talked about earlier, that there are higher wages for males than females, and so a female can go to college and start to make what an uneducated man makes, and so and actually, just FYI, the Latina gets the greatest return on her college investment, and that's because Latinas work, their pay for their labor is the lowest. I hope that makes sense, without the college education. So there's that particular issue. My question for you is Alfredo Miranda. I don't know if you know who he is.
Alfredo Miranda?
Yeah. So he wrote this book, Halos USA, and it's about from where Scott and I actually reside, which is Turlock, just a little bit south of here. And I was curious because you had said that when you were talking about the demographics, and you were saying that they kind of were misrepresenting things because, just because you're born here, I'm paraphrasing sort of badly what you said, just because you're born here doesn't mean that you're going to identify here with the U.S., and a lot of children identify with Mexico. And he said kind of a little bit of, not the opposite, but he seemed to break it down a little bit differently, because he was talking about, what did he call it, transnational communities. And in fact, that the schisms could be even within families, because you have children, maybe a child would be born here in the United States, and then the next child after them might be born in Mexico, and then the next child after that would be born here. And that oftentimes a lot of the differentiation between the children and the schisms is based on whether or not you are American or Mexican. And I was wondering if you could maybe address that.
Sure. I wish I could show you my notes, because I was exactly, the cultural formations include siblings. Mm-hmm. You have an older brother born in Mexico on the one hand, you're brought over at age 3, and by the time you're 8, 9 years old, you're very different from your older brother, who decided to quit school because he just couldn't deal with the language proficiency issues of going through high school and just drops out after the sophomore year or something to that effect. It's also about parents and the parental attitudes toward male, females, and the like. immigrant women find it easier to find steady jobs than the men. And this is particularly true in the San Joaquin Valley for the obvious reasons about agriculturally related work. A third element is who is your peer group? Dinuba is one thing. Modesto is another. Clovis is one thing. Kerman, California is another. And that's another factor. The other element that I think is really important is notions of masculinity change. And this changes over time. Let me give you an example. If you're Mexicano, you wear botas. You buy boots. You're here long enough, you want sneakers. All right? Sort of thing. And those are the little things that if you look carefully at the cultural spaces where Mexicanos congregate, whether it's at a park or whether you go to the county fair and they're having some kind of Mexican-related event and so on, if you look carefully, you can see the gradations there. And the schisms are not necessarily, how shall I say it, violent in any way. But Pierre Bourdieu makes this great insight, right, what he calls symbolic violence. And the symbolic violence that we're seeing is people struggling to find a way of defining themselves. And that is a constant negotiation. And for many, that negotiation is about language. And part of that negotiation is about attire, where you start learning to have baseball caps. And the transnationality means you go to Mexico now and you see a lot of young men in Mexico who haven't come to the United States who are wearing baseball caps because it's been brought over and it's over there. Oaxaca, I've been there for Dia de los Muertos. And I have little kids who do speak no English, but they know trick or treat. And they're wearing Spider-Man suits, all right, sort of thing, right? That's a transnationality. And that transnationality is doubled, in a manner of speaking, in places like the Central Valley, because so many of them still go back and forth. By the second generation, less. By the third generation, almost none. All right? Maybe grandpa and grandma want to go back to the old village and see their old friends and so on, but very often the young people don't want to go back. Right? They're rooted here now. And in that sense, you have these permutations over time, whether you're male and female. Is also an aspect here. So all those elements are involved. And if you do enough interviews, like I do, how do you capture that nuance? How do you capture that, that subtlety that too often sociologists take a snapshot. This is the way it is. But it doesn't take that same person through that process. And that's, again, the novelist who can do that would be a bestseller here in the Central Valley.
I was very intrigued by how you're talking about the 4 different valleys within the Central Valley. So there's metropolitan, micropolitan, and then you
Rural.
Rural and then urban?
Bay Areas.
No.
Bay Area, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. For the third valley, with Winton, what are some other examples of cities that fall into the third valley? Is what
You mean like rural communities?
that you would consider that are within the third valley?
I would say probably 80% of the communities in the Central Valley. All right. I mean, you just. I mean, I didn't show all the slides, but you go outside of Modesto, 15, 20 miles in either direction, and it's another planet. It's another world. No Starbucks. No In-N-Out, etc. It's uncivilized. This is barbarous, etc. Right. So when the In-N-Out arrives to Kalinga, I'll never forget it, right? It was a big deal. Everybody was pulling in, right? Oh, we got an In-N-Out. It's kind of like the days where Kmart was big, right? My town got a Kmart, right? All right, we're there, right? Like Madera got a Walmart. We have Starbucks now, etc. We're civilized. We have left, in a sense, Timbuktu, and now we're modern. If you will, having a theater in town, etc., etc. So, if you there's again, I wish I could have had more time. The cultural amenities of that sort, just having a cinema, and it's amazing how many small communities people can't go easily just to go see a movie. All right, and what happens in classrooms. Oh, have you seen this? And some of you grew up in modest homes. You know what it was like when people, what did you do during the summer? We went to Disneyland. Ooh, you went to Disneyland? Because it was outside our grasp, in a manner of speaking. And that still happens to kids, whether it's about where they go on vacation, what experiences they've had, where they go shopping, etc. You know, it's not something that is in the past. It's very much in the present, and more so given the nature, characteristics, and so on of the valley in that respect.
I had a question about that 6% that is still working in ag in the state.
Mhm.
And are these mainly now these indigenous peoples that are these later migrations from the non-traditional migration areas?
No. How to put it? It depends in part on the crop. It depends in part on the level of transnationality. A lot of people that came from Oaxaca, Veracruz, etc., initially took over the jobs and the transnationality of the previous surge of immigrants. But they began to what demographers call settle out. They come 2 or 3 times, and then they start realizing that Farmer John wants him there for a longer period of time, not just for that period of time when the picking of the grapes take place or the harvest of the tomatoes and so on, because you're a good worker, Jose, and so on. And in that regard, then they begin to settle down. They bring the family and so forth and so on. So in terms of, say, the grape harvest, or better yet, the Salinas Valley, it used to be that 80% of the people that cut the lettuce, that work on those big spider-like things that pick up the lettuce and so on, were undocumented. But that population has been greatly reduced in that regard. They have become resident farm workers like my parents were and I grew up with as a resident farm worker. We stopped migrating and this sort of thing. And that led to a migratory flow that supplemented what had been our story, now became the story of the Oaxacans and so forth and so on. Anyway, so it depends in part on what we are talking about. The Sonoma, Napa Sonoma, now it used to be 80% of the people who picked the grapes and so on were undocumented and so on, went back and forth. Now it's closer to 20% because so many of them have settled out. Anyone who knows about good wine, you need good skilled labor. And good skilled grape pickers are going to pick the best grapes for you. And it's amazing in that respect how many have settled out because they have good steady jobs, because the wine industry is a 9-month industry, right? It starts with planting, the pruning, the tying of the vines, and it goes all the way through the harvest and so on, and then the post-harvest labor. That can take 9 months from beginning to end. So you only have to worry about 2 or 3 months. You're here resident, you're here legally, you can get unemployment and so forth and so on. And then, of course, some of them become permanent members of the workforce versus what is taking place in, say, Madera or Fresno County, in Mendota and so on, for the cantaloupes and the tomatoes, and that's it. And so the work cycle is shorter in that regard. And people have to decide, do I follow the crops, which most of them don't? They just go back. They take the money and go back.
And it's the same in the Salinas Valley. There's 3 crops of strawberries, 3 crops of lettuce. So there's always something to pick. So it's almost self-contained now because they, fertilize and you can keep growing crops. And so there's a lot of labor. So,
I mean, there are multiple strawberry harvests. And that's why you see the strawberries at different stages of development, because it provides for people to go from one strawberry patch to the other. And those of us who go up and down 101, you see the lettuce doing the same thing, because it keeps the labor cycle going. Rather than planting everything all at once, you cut the lettuce and you have to sit down and wait. No, you're just going to keep the lettuce going in a manner of speaking.
All right, so I think we'll give the last question to George. You have a question?
I'd like to play the trump card.
Oh, the trump card.
Let me offer this. One for Susan, one for Alex. So if a Trump candidacy would happen, how would Mr. Steinbeck, how would that arouse his fury today? And then secondly, would a Trump candidacy bring Latinos to the polls?
SB 1070, Arizona.
Yeah.
Everyone expected that there would be a surge of Latinos registering, getting out to vote. It didn't happen. In the case of Trump, undoubtedly there will be some Latinos who are native born, just out of anger, despair, if you want, who will come out to vote in greater numbers. But I think what has taken place is a growing cynicism about the political system and how it works. How can we have a Trump become a viable presidential contender, right? And believe me, a lot of Republicans are asking themselves the same question. And I think for a lot of Latinos, it's an example of how the political system does not work. So who am I to think that my vote is going to change it? It feeds on the skepticism that now has become cynicism. The other side of that is, for a lot of Latinos, and you hear this on Spanish language radio, and they're asking themselves, how could this happen? What is going on? The issue is not Trump. The issue are the people who are willing to tell pollsters, you're damn right, I'm going to vote for this guy. That to me is the scary part, not Trump. It's who are the people that are buying into his candidacy? And more importantly, what are their motivations? Is it anger? Some of you may remember the Michael Douglas movie, Falling Down, right? Sort of thing. That was one part of it. But people are trying to understand, where is this anger coming from that allows people to make statements like this and have people stand up and cheer, sort of thing. That to me is the worst part. And when Univision, Telemundo, which is just down the street, right, sort of thing, shows on television people doing that, it feeds that skepticism, if not cynicism, about how the system is working. Because it's not working for me now, and this guy could possibly be president.
But did they know many of other people also feel the same way? They're not the only ones that are wondering, how could this happen?
But I go back to my point. When you have segregation that is increasingly getting worse, there's no one else to talk to. And the unions are weak, I don't need to tell you, right? Especially here in the Central Valley. Even, it's the Supreme Court's going to rule on the question of teachers and this sort of thing, right? The case that's up before the Supreme Court. Unions are not doing political education in the Valley because they're investing primarily in urban, concentrated areas, which is understandable if you're a union organizer and the like. We're not getting political education from the Democratic Party. The investment of the Democratic Party in registering voters and so on is very low for reasons that I wish I understood. Libre, on the Republican side, they're investing $13 million in getting out the Latino vote. But when you think about 13 million and you divide it up among the top 10 states that have Latinos, that's not a lot of money. The Democrats spent the least amount of money on Spanish language radio in the 2012 and 2014 elections. So what is going on? Some people say, see, it's another example. They know we're not going to vote for a Republican by and large. They're taking us for granted because we have no choice but to vote for a Democrat. All those things feed into what the response could be. And SB 1070 is a good example. The polls clearly show that for a lot of Latinos, they're just not buying in, particularly the recently arrived, if you will, except for those who have naturalized. The people who have naturalized and have become citizens have a higher turnout rate than U.S.-born third-generation Latinos.
Very good. Thank you both so much. We really appreciate it.